I never thought a simple exploration could turn into a living nightmare. But when my own scream echoed through this abandoned hospital, it wasn't just my terror I felt. It was the ghostly presence of the protocols that should have sprung to life, the unseen forces that should have responded. Come with me as we peel back the layers of dust and decay to expose the horrifying truth of what happens when panic meets procedure in a forgotten space. The cold hit me first. Not the pleasant coolness of air conditioning, but the bone-deep chill of a place that had forgotten what warmth meant. February in the northern districts always brought harsh weather, but inside St. Catherine's Medical Center, the cold felt different. It felt deliberate, as though the building itself had decided to reject any memory of the living bodies that once filled its corridors. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating particles of dust that hung suspended in the air like frozen thoughts. The metallic scent came next, not quite rust, not quite blood, but something that lived in the space between both. It coated the back of my throat with each breath, a taste of decay that no amount of swallowing could wash away. My partner, Jamie, stood beside me at the entrance, their camera equipment clicking softly as they adjusted settings for the low light. We were urban explorers, veterans of dozens of abandoned sites, but something about St. Catherine's felt fundamentally wrong from the moment we breached the chain-link fence surrounding its perimeter. The hospital had closed 7 years ago, a victim of budget cuts and consolidation. The state had promised redevelopment, a conversion into affordable housing or a community center, but those promises had dissolved like sugar in rain. Now it stood as a monument to institutional failure, 3 stories of concrete and shattered glass that the city seemed determined to pretend didn't exist. Jamie had pitched the exploration to our online following as a Valentine's Day special, a twisted romance with decay. The irony wasn't lost on me as we stepped through the emergency room entrance, the automatic doors long since frozen in a permanent half-open position. My boots crunched on broken glass and debris. The emergency room reception area stretched before us, a vast space that should have been filled with anxious voices and hurried footsteps. Instead, silence pressed against my eardrums like physical weight. Overturned chairs created a maze of metal and plastic. Patient intake forms from 2019 lay scattered across the floor, their edges curled and yellowed, personal information slowly fading into illegibility. Someone named Patricia Holloway had complained of chest pains on March 15th. Someone else, a child whose name was now smudged beyond recognition, had arrived with a broken arm. The beam of my flashlight caught something that made me pause. A wheelchair sat in the corner, positioned as though someone had simply stepped away for a moment and would return any second. A faded blanket still draped across its seat, and for a moment I could almost see the ghost of whoever had last occupied it. Were they healed? Had they walked out on their own? Or had they been wheeled to some other department, some other fate? The questions felt important, though I couldn't articulate why. Jamie moved ahead, their footsteps echoing in ways that shouldn't have been possible in a space this large. Echo implies return, a sound bouncing back from surfaces and finding its way home. But these sounds didn't return. They simply existed, hanging in the air like accusations. We had explored abandoned places before, factories, schools, even a decommissioned prison upstate, but St. Catherine's felt different. Those other places had felt empty. This place felt waiting. We moved deeper into the complex, following a corridor marked with peeling signs indicating radiology and laboratory services. The walls here had once been painted a cheerful yellow, an attempt to brighten the experience of medical anxiety. Now they were stained with water damage and something darker that I didn't want to examine too closely. Ceiling tiles had collapsed in sections, revealing the skeletal infrastructure of pipes and wiring above. Nature had begun its slow reclamation, thin vines creeping through cracks in the foundation, their leaves pale and sickly in the absence of proper sunlight. That's when I heard it the first time. Not the scream, not yet. This was subtler, a sound that lived on the edge of perception. A creak, perhaps, or the settling of old bones. Buildings make sounds, I told myself. Structures shift and adjust, metal expands and contracts with temperature changes. But this sound carried intention, or at least the suggestion of intention. It came from somewhere above us, from the second floor where the patient rooms would have been located. Jamie heard it too. I could tell by the way their hand tightened on their camera, by the slight pause in their documentation. We locked eyes, and in that moment of silent communication, we both knew we should leave. We should turn around, walk back through that emergency entrance, return to our car parked 3 blocks away where we'd left it to avoid attention from whatever security might still patrol the area. We should go home, edit the footage we'd already captured, and call it a successful exploration. But we didn't, because urban exploration isn't just about documenting decay. It's about pushing boundaries, about seeing what others won't, about proving to yourself that you're brave enough to stand in the spaces society has abandoned. It's about the story, and deep down, both of us knew this place had a story it wanted to tell. The question was whether we wanted to hear it. The sound came again, louder this time, more insistent. Not quite a voice, but not quite random noise either. Something in between, something that suggested purpose without revealing intent. My heart rate picked up, that primal warning system that evolution had gifted humanity firing on all cylinders. Danger, it whispered. Threat, run. I took a step forward instead. Jamie followed, their camera light joining my flashlight to push back against the darkness. The corridor ahead seemed to stretch impossibly long, perspective warping in the inconsistent illumination. Doors lined both sides, most hanging open on broken hinges, revealing examination rooms stripped of equipment but still bearing the ghosts of their purpose. An eye chart on one wall, a cabinet with empty shelves, a sink with rust staining the porcelain basin. We were halfway down the corridor when the temperature dropped even further. I could see my breath now, small clouds of condensation that appeared and vanished with each exhalation. Jamie's hands trembled slightly, though whether from cold or fear I couldn't determine. Probably both. Definitely both. The sound came a third time, and this time I could locate it. The stairwell. The emergency stairs at the far end of the corridor that would take us up to the second floor, to the patient wards where the real heart of the hospital had once beat its steady rhythm of healing and hope. The door to the stairwell stood partially open, darkness beyond it so complete that our light seemed to die at its threshold. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, to reconsider, to make the rational choice that would keep us safe. But curiosity is a powerful drug, and I had been chasing its high for too long to quit now. I reached for the stairwell door, my fingers closing around the cold metal handle, and pulled it fully open. The hinges shrieked in protest, a sound that seemed to announce our presence to whatever dwelled in the darkness above. We started climbing, each step a commitment we couldn't take back. The scream shattered everything. Not my scream, not yet, but a sound so raw, so absolutely human in its terror that it froze my blood mid-circulation. It came from somewhere above us, echoing down the stairwell with a clarity that shouldn't have been possible in a space this acoustically dead. This wasn't the ambient sounds of a settling building or the tricks that wind plays through broken windows. This was a person, or something that had once been a person, expressing an agony so profound that language had abandoned it entirely. Jamie dropped their camera. The crash of expensive equipment hitting concrete barely registered as we both pressed our backs against the wall, every muscle locked in that ancient response pattern: freeze first, then decide between fight or flight. The scream stretched on, impossibly long, a single note of pure horror that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate directly in my chest cavity. I felt it in my teeth, in my bones, in the spaces between thoughts where primal fear lives. Then silence, absolute suffocating silence that felt worse than the scream itself. Because screams are reactions, responses to immediate threats. Silence is the void that remains after, the empty space where action should occur but doesn't. My hands shook as I tried to steady my flashlight, the beam dancing erratically across the walls of the stairwell. Jamie had recovered enough to retrieve their camera, checking it for damage with trembling fingers, but their eyes kept darting upward toward the source of that terrible sound. Every instinct demanded I run. Evolution had spent millions of years programming my ancestors to flee from sounds like that, to recognize the markers of danger and respond with immediate self-preservation. The fight or flight response flooded my system with adrenaline, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape my chest. Sweat broke out across my skin despite the cold, and my breath came in short, sharp gasps that I struggled to control. But something else held me in place. Not courage, I'm not fool enough to mistake frozen terror for bravery, but a creeping realization that was almost worse than the scream itself. No alarm had sounded, no emergency lights had flickered to life, no running footsteps responded to that cry of distress. The building remained inert, indifferent, utterly unmoved by the horror that had just echoed through its corridors. In a functioning hospital, a scream like that would trigger immediate response. I found myself mentally cataloging the protocols I'd learned during a first aid course certification course 3 years ago. Code red for fire, code blue for cardiac arrest, code silver for weapons or hostage situations. Surely there was some designation for a patient in extreme distress, some color-coded alert that would send nurses and security personnel flooding toward the source of that sound. Emergency call buttons in every room, panic alarms at nursing stations, a whole infrastructure designed to ensure that no cry for help went unanswered. But St. Catherine's had no infrastructure anymore. No staff, no protocols, no safety nets. The systems designed to respond to human suffering had been decommissioned, stripped away, abandoned along with everything else. The realization hit me with physical force. We were completely alone. If that scream had come from a person in genuine distress, no help would arrive, no rescue would occur. They were as abandoned as the building itself, left to whatever fate had drawn that sound from their throat. The implications spiraled outward in my mind. What if someone was actually hurt up there? What if a homeless person had taken shelter in the building and suffered some medical emergency? What if another urban explorer had fallen through rotted flooring or encountered some structural hazard? The scream had been too visceral, too specific to be anything other than genuine human terror or pain. "We should check," Jamie whispered, their voice barely audible. They didn't sound convinced by their own suggestion, but I understood the impulse. We couldn't just leave, not without knowing. The curse of curiosity, the burden of conscience, they combined into an obligation we couldn't ignore despite every survival instinct screaming otherwise. I nodded, unable to form words around the lump of fear lodged in my throat. We began climbing again, slower this time, each step deliberate and measured. The stairwell stretched upward, concrete steps worn smooth by thousands of footsteps over the hospital's operational lifetime. How many people had climbed these stairs in moments of crisis? How many doctors had rushed upward towards emergencies? How many family members had raced to be with their loved ones in their final moments? The second-floor landing appeared ahead, marked by a door with a faded sign reading Patient Care Ward B. The door hung slightly ajar, darkness beyond it so complete it seemed to absorb our flashlight beams rather than reflect them. I could hear Jamie's breathing behind me, rapid and shallow, matching my own accelerated rhythm. My hand reached for the door, and I noticed abstractly that my fingers had gone numb from a combination of cold and fear. The door opened silently, well-oiled hinges making no sound despite years of abandonment. That detail struck me as wrong. Everything else in this building groaned and protested with age, but this door moved like it had been maintained, like someone still cared about its function. The patient ward stretched before us, a long corridor lined with rooms on both sides. Nurses' station sat abandoned in the center, its desk covered in papers that had never been properly filed away. Someone's coffee mug still sat on the counter, filled with something that had long ago evaporated or transformed into sediment. We moved forward, our lights revealing details in fragments. A wheelchair tipped on its side, an IV stand lying across the corridor like a fallen soldier. Doors hanging open revealed rooms in various states of disorder. Some appeared almost neat, beds stripped but otherwise intact. Others showed signs of hurried departure, medical equipment pushed aside, sheets tangled on the floor, personal belongings left behind in whatever crisis had marked the hospital's final days. The protocol should have been simple. In a functioning facility, that screen would have prompted immediate action. A nurse would have activated the call system. Security would have been notified. A team would have responded with specific roles, one to assess the situation, one to contact emergency services if needed, one to secure the area and ensure staff safety. There would have been documentation, incident reports, follow-up procedures, a whole bureaucratic machine designed to transform human crisis into manageable process. But the machine was dead. The building had become a tomb for the very systems meant to protect life. No emergency call buttons worked because there was no one to answer them. No intercoms functioned because there were no voices to broadcast. No procedures activated because there was no institution left to implement them. We stood in the skeletal remains of a safety net, and the void where protection should have been felt more terrifying than any specific threat. Jamie tapped my shoulder, pointing their camera light toward one of the patient rooms. The door stood fully open, unlike most of the others, and something about the darkness inside seemed different, deeper somehow, more intentional. I didn't want to look, didn't want to approach, but we had come this far. Turning back now felt like betrayal of ourselves, of whoever had screamed, of the principle that drove us to explore these forgotten spaces in the first place. We entered the room together, shoulder to shoulder, our combined lights pushing back against the dark. The space was larger than I expected, clearly designed for multiple patients. 3 hospital beds remained, their frames rusted and mattresses long since removed. Medical equipment cabinets stood empty, their doors hanging open to reveal nothing but dust and spider webs. A window on the far wall offered a view of the hospital's rear parking lot, now overgrown with weeds that pushed through cracks in the asphalt. But it was the wall itself that captured my attention. Messages covered every inch of available space, written in what looked like marker or paint, or, my stomach clenched, something darker and more organic. They weren't coherent sentences, but fragments, desperate scrawls that spoke of abandonment and fear. Day 3, no one comes. Pressed the button, nothing happens. Where are they? Protocol failed, protocol failed, protocol failed. The words repeated, overlapping, growing more frantic as they spread across the wall like a virus of desperation. Someone had been here after the hospital closed. Someone had needed help and found only silence. Someone had discovered, just as we were discovering now, that the safety systems we take for granted can simply cease to exist. And worst of all, written in the bottom right corner in letters that seemed fresher than the others, more recent. "You'll scream too. Everyone does. No one answers." I stumbled backward from the wall, my light sweeping across those desperate messages like an accusation. Jamie caught my arm, steadying me, but I could feel their hand trembling against my jacket. The words refused to leave my vision even when I looked away, burned into my retinas like after images of horror. Someone had stood in this room, in this exact spot, and learned the most terrifying truth, that safety is not a guarantee, but a service, and services can be terminated. My mind raced through fragments of training I'd barely paid attention to years ago. I'd taken a job as a hospital porter during college, spending 6 months pushing gurneys and delivering specimens to the lab. During orientation, they drilled us on emergency protocols with the same boring repetition they used for hand hygiene and patient privacy regulations. I remembered the presenter, a stern woman with reading glasses on a chain, clicking through PowerPoint slides that outlined response procedures. Code red, fire. Code blue, cardiac arrest. Code yellow, missing patient. Code silver, person with a weapon. Code gray, combative person. Code orange, hazardous material spill. Code pink, infant abduction. Each code triggered a specific choreographed response, a dance of trained personnel moving with practiced efficiency to contain crisis and minimize harm. The system was designed with redundancy, with multiple layers of fail-safes to ensure that no emergency went unaddressed. The presenter had emphasized the importance of the nurse call system, that simple button patients could press from their beds that would light up a panel at the nurse's station and trigger an immediate check-in. Every call must receive a response within 2 minutes, she'd said, her tone leaving no room for debate. Every single one, because you never know when those 2 minutes mean the difference between life and death. But what happened when there was no nurse's station to light up? What happened when the 2-minute response time extended into infinity because there was no one left to respond? The questions clawed at my chest with sharp, insistent talons. Jamie had moved to one of the hospital beds, their camera focused on something attached to the frame. I joined them, my flashlight revealing a patient information card still clipped to the metal railing. The plastic sleeve had protected it from the worst of the decay, leaving the text mostly legible. Patient name, Robert Kimura. Admission date, March 3, 2019. Primary physician, Dr. Helena Rodriguez. Allergies, penicillin. The mundane details of a life reduced to bureaucratic shorthand. "This was less than a month before they closed," Jamie whispered, running their finger along the date. "He was here during the transition, maybe one of the last patients before they moved everyone out. Or maybe not moved out at all," a dark voice in my head suggested. "Maybe forgotten in the chaos of shutdown. Maybe left behind when the administration focused on protecting themselves legally rather than protecting the vulnerable people in their care." I pushed the thought away, but it clung to my consciousness like oil, contaminating every subsequent thought. I pulled out my phone. The screen's glow alien and harsh in the darkness. No signal, of course. These old hospital buildings were notorious dead zones, even when operational, their thick concrete walls blocking cellular signals. But I had downloaded several articles about hospital closures before our exploration, thinking they might provide interesting context for our documentation. Now they served a different purpose entirely. Opening my notes app, I found an archived article from a healthcare administration journal titled "Emergency Preparedness in Facility Decommissioning." The dry academic language suddenly felt vitally important. When a medical facility undergoes closure, a comprehensive transition protocol must be implemented to ensure continuity of care. This includes patient transfer arrangements, medical records management, and the systematic deactivation of emergency response systems. Critical infrastructure such as nurse call buttons, emergency alert systems, and emergency power supplies must be formally decommissioned following OSHA and Joint Commission guidelines. Failure to properly document this decommissioning process can result in legal liability and potential hazard to unauthorized persons accessing the facility post-closure. Unauthorized persons, like us, like whoever wrote those messages on the wall. The article continued with clinical detachment to outline the proper procedure. Shut down the central monitoring system, disable automatic emergency notifications, remove or deactivate emergency call buttons, post appropriate signage indicating facility status, and secure the premises to prevent unauthorized access. They'd done all of that, presumably. They'd followed their checklists and ticked their boxes and filed their paperwork. But the article said nothing about what happened to the muscle memory of crisis, the deeply ingrained expectation that screaming in a hospital would bring help. It said nothing about the psychological horror of finding yourself in a space designed for protection that now offered none. Jamie had moved to the window, their camera capturing the view of the overgrown parking lot. "Look at this," they said, zooming in on something below. I joined them, following their line of sight. In the far corner of the lot, barely visible through the weeds, sat an old ambulance, not abandoned casually, but deliberately parked, its emergency lights long since dark, its purpose terminated as decisively as the hospital itself. "They decommissioned everything," I said, the words tasting like ash. "The whole emergency response infrastructure. They shut it down piece by piece, following their protocols for shutdown instead of their protocols for crisis." The irony wasn't lost on me. The hospital had procedures for everything, including its own death. They'd probably held meetings, formed committees, drafted documentation. Some administrator had signed forms authorizing the disconnection of life-saving systems. Someone else had removed the emergency signage, the code blue alerts, the emergency exit markers. They'd done it methodically, professionally, following best practices for institutional termination. But they couldn't decommission the human expectation of response. They couldn't file paperwork to stop people from screaming when terrified, or from expecting that scream to trigger help. The physical infrastructure could be shut down, but the psychological infrastructure, the social contract that says we care for each other in moments of crisis, that existed independent of any institution. My flashlight caught something else on the wall, partially hidden behind a bed frame. I moved closer, my pulse quickening. It was a floor plan, yellowed and water-stained, but still mostly legible. Someone had marked it up extensively, drawing arrows and circles, adding notes in cramped handwriting. Patient rooms were numbered and designated by specialty: cardiac care, respiratory therapy, post-surgical recovery. The nurses' stations were clearly marked at the center of each ward, strategic positions from which staff could monitor and respond to multiple rooms simultaneously. But what drew my eye was a series of red X marks over each nurse's station, over the medication rooms, over the emergency supply closets. Someone had systematically marked every point of potential response, every place where help should have originated. And next to each X, a single word: empty. Whoever had made this map had done so after the closure. They'd explored the hospital systematically, checking each response point, discovering the same devastating truth at every location. The infrastructure of care had been extracted, leaving only the shell, only the promise without the means to fulfill it. I photographed the map with my phone, the flash illuminating the room in harsh white light for a fraction of a second. In that brief moment, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the floor next to the far bed, partially hidden in shadow, was a sleeping bag. Recent, relatively clean, the kind you could buy at any outdoor supply store. Someone had been staying here, not years ago during the closure, but recently, maybe even within the last few weeks. Jamie saw it too. We approached together, our lights revealing more details. A backpack leaned against the wall, its contents spilling out. Energy bar wrappers, a water bottle, a paperback novel with a bookmark halfway through. A sleeping bag spread across an old hospital mattress frame, as if someone had tried to create a home in this monument to institutional failure. "They're squatting here," Jamie breathed. "Someone's actually living in this place." The realization brought competing emotions. Relief that we hadn't encountered a ghost or supernatural entity, that the scream might have come from a person we could actually help. But also a deeper, more complex horror, because this meant someone had no better option than sleeping in an abandoned hospital, surrounded by the corpses of emergency systems, existing in a space where the very architecture screamed abandonment and neglect. I knelt beside the backpack, careful not to touch anything. A hospital ID badge was clipped to the strap, the photo faded but still visible. The name had been scratched off deliberately, but the designation was clear: registered nurse. This wasn't just anyone squatting here. This was someone who had once worked in this building, someone who had once been part of the response system that no longer existed. They had returned to the place where they used to save lives, only to discover it could no longer save anyone, including themselves. The sleeping bag's occupant was gone, but their presence lingered like a stain on reality itself. I stood frozen, trying to reconcile the evidence before me with any narrative that made sense. A former nurse, living in the ruins of their workplace, surrounded by the ghost of protocols they'd once enacted. What series of failures, what cascade of abandonment had led to this moment? Jamie was already moving, following the corridor deeper into the patient ward. Their professional instinct had overtaken their fear. Document first, process later. I forced myself to follow, though every step felt like walking deeper into the chest cavity of something long dead. Our lights swept across more rooms, more evidence of both rapid abandonment and recent habitation. In one room, someone had arranged empty food containers in neat rows, creating order out of chaos. In another, pages torn from medical textbooks covered the walls, passages highlighted, notes scrawled in margins. The nurse, I'd started thinking of them that way, though I had no proof of their identity, had been studying emergency procedures, crisis response protocols, trauma care techniques. They'd created a shrine to the very systems that had failed them, copying out procedures by hand as if the act of writing might resurrect the dead infrastructure. In cases of respiratory distress, immediately notify attending physician and prepare emergency equipment. But there was no physician to notify. Activate Code Blue protocol for unresponsive patients, but there was no protocol to activate. We found more messages as we progressed, written on walls and doors and even the floor. Some were practical. Ward B cleared, no medical supplies remain. Others descended into something darker. Day 47, still no response to emergency calls. And finally, most chilling, the protocols are ghosts. They haunt but cannot help. My radio crackled. We'd brought walkie-talkies as a backup communication method, though I'd forgotten we were even carrying them. Jamie's voice came through, staticky and distorted. "Third floor, I'm heading up. Something's wrong with the stairwell." I wanted to object, to insist we stay together, but they were already gone. I stood alone in the corridor, my flashlight the only defense against darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. The temperature had dropped even further, my breath now visible in thick clouds that hung in the air like question marks. A sound reached me then, not quite the scream from before, but its echo, its memory, a whimper perhaps, or the wind moving through broken windows in a pattern that mimicked distress. I followed it, drawn by the same compulsion that had brought us to this place. The corridor opened into a larger space, what must have been a communal area for patients, perhaps a day room where those well enough could gather, watch television, pretend for a few hours that they were anywhere but a hospital. The room still held furniture, though most of it had been overturned or damaged. A television mounted on the wall hung at an angle, its screen shattered. Chairs and couches formed a haphazard barrier against the far wall, as if someone had tried to fortify the space. And in the center of it all, an overturned stretcher lay on its side, leather restraints dangling from its frame like dead vines. I approached the stretcher with visceral reluctance, each step requiring conscious effort to overcome my body's screaming demand to flee. The metal frame was old but not rusted. Someone had maintained it, or at least used it recently enough that decay hadn't taken hold. The restraints showed signs of struggle, leather worn where wrists and ankles had pulled against confinement. My stomach clenched as I imagined the scenario. Someone strapped to this stretcher, unable to move, screaming for help that would never arrive. Next to the stretcher lay a clipboard with papers still attached. Patient transfer form, dated February 4th, 2026, yesterday. My hands shook as I lifted the clipboard, angling my flashlight to read the handwriting. It wasn't an official hospital form, but a recreation, someone filling out bureaucratic paperwork from memory in an attempt to impose order on chaos. Patient name, scribbled out, presenting symptoms, acute psychological distress, auditory hallucinations,
persistent belief that emergency protocols remain active. Treatment, attempted reality orientation, unsuccessful. Disposition, unable to transfer. No functioning facilities remain. The words blurred as I read them. This wasn't documentation of a patient. This was someone documenting themselves, creating the structure of medical care in its absence, performing the rituals of protocol when the substance had long since evaporated. I flipped through the pages, finding more self-created forms. Incident reports describing events that had occurred in the abandoned hospital. 2300 hours. Heard scream from second floor. Responded per code red protocol. Found no fire. 0300 hours. Activated emergency call system. No response. Realized system non-functional. 0800 hours. Attempted to contact supervisor. Remembered no supervisors remain. The progression was heartbreaking. At first, the nurse had responded to every sound, every potential emergency, activating protocols purely out of muscle memory and professional obligation. But gradually, the reports changed tone. 1200 hours, ignored scream from West Wing, recognized my own voice from earlier. 1800 hours, stopped pressing call buttons, they never worked. 0000 hours, understand now that I am the emergency, and there is no protocol for this. The final entry was dated today, February 5th, 2026, and written in shaking handwriting that barely resembled the precise penmanship of earlier entries. The protocol is simple. Scream and no one comes. That's the new protocol. That's the only protocol left. A crash from above startled me so badly I dropped the clipboard. Jamie's voice came through the radio again, higher pitched, threaded with panic. "Get up here, now! 3rd floor, maternity ward. You need to see this." I ran, my earlier caution abandoned. The stairwell swallowed me, darkness so complete that my flashlight seemed to create more shadows than it dispelled. 3rd floor, maternity ward, where babies had been born into the promise of life and care, where the most vulnerable had been protected by the full weight of medical infrastructure. What could possibly be there now? The door to the maternity ward hung off its hinges, revealing a corridor even more deteriorated than those below. Water damage had collapsed parts of the ceiling, exposing pipes and wiring. The nurses' station here had been completely gutted, equipment removed so thoroughly that even the countertops had been torn out, leaving only gaping holes in the wall. I found Jamie in what must have been a delivery room, their camera hanging forgotten from their hand as they stared at the far wall. I joined them, my light joining theirs to illuminate what they'd discovered. The entire wall was covered in ID badges, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, pinned or taped or glued to form a collage of faces. Doctors, nurses, technicians, administrators, all staring out from plastic rectangles with varying expressions of professional confidence. But someone had drawn on them, altered them. Red marker had been used to X out eyes, to draw tears, to add screaming mouths to neutral expressions. And written across the top in letters 3 feet high, "They left us to die." Below that, in smaller text, more accusations. Dr. Morrison signed the closure papers. Nurse Thompson took early retirement. Administrator Davis moved to a better hospital. Names crossed out, dates marked, a ledger of abandonment maintained with obsessive detail. But it was what hung in the center that truly broke something inside me. A single hospital gown, adult-sized, hanging from the ceiling like a flag of surrender, and pinned to its chest a handwritten note in the same shaking handwriting from the transfer forms. I stayed. I kept working. I maintained protocols. But protocols need power, need staff, need an institution behind them. What good is knowing CPR when there's no defibrillator? What good is calling code blue when no one will come? I am the last emergency responder in an emergency that never ends, and I cannot save myself. The radio crackled one final time, but it wasn't Jamie's voice that came through. It was different, hollow, echoing as if coming from a vast distance or a great depth. You found my station. You understand now. This is what happens when systems fail. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, through 1,000 small abandonments, until the people who needed help discovered there is no help left, until the infrastructure of care becomes the infrastructure of neglect. Jamie and I backed towards the door, our lights sweeping frantically across the room. The voice continued, sourceless, omnipresent. I pressed the buttons. I followed the protocols. I screamed, and no one came, because the protocols had been decommissioned, because I had been decommissioned, because care is not a right but a service, and services can be terminated. We ran. There's no dignity in admitting it, but we ran like children fleeing darkness, our equipment banging against walls and door frames, our lights creating manic patterns as we fled. Down the stairs, through the patient ward, past the emergency room reception area where this nightmare had begun. We didn't stop until we burst through the entrance, stumbling into the February night, the cold air shocking after the death scent of the hospital. Behind us, St. Catherine's Medical Center stood silent and dark, its broken windows reflecting nothing, its doors permanently open to anyone desperate or curious enough to enter. And somewhere inside, in rooms we'd explored or hadn't yet discovered, the ghost of protocols continued its endless vigil, waiting for emergency calls that would never be answered, maintaining systems that had long since ceased to function. We didn't look back as we ran to our car. We didn't speak as Jamie started the engine and pulled away, tires squealing. But I know we were both thinking the same thing. Somewhere in that building, a nurse who dedicated their life to emergency response had finally become the emergency they couldn't solve, and the protocols they'd memorized, the systems they'd trusted, had offered nothing but the echo of their own screaming. 3 hours later, we sat in an all-night diner 15 miles from St. Catherine's, nursing coffee that had grown cold while we stared at nothing. The normal world felt like an insult. Truck drivers laughed at the counter. A waitress refilled someone's cup, the mundane act of care and service so routine she didn't even think about it. The fluorescent lights hummed with reliable electricity. The emergency exit signs glowed their steady red, and somewhere behind the swinging kitchen doors, I knew there was a first aid kit, fire extinguisher, and probably a phone with emergency numbers posted beside it. All the infrastructure of safety we take for granted, so invisible in its reliability that we only notice it when it's absent. Jamie hadn't said a word since we'd left the hospital. Their camera sat on the table between us, memory card full of footage we both knew we'd never post. Some stories weren't meant for clicks and views. Some horrors didn't translate to entertainment. This was something else entirely, a glimpse into the void that opens when the social contract fractures, when the systems we build to protect each other simply stop. My phone buzzed. A news alert. St. Catherine's Medical Center slated for demolition March 2026. The article was brief, bureaucratic. The building had been deemed structurally unsound, a public hazard. Demolition crews would begin work in 3 weeks. The land would be cleared, sold, redeveloped into something profitable. The article made no mention of anyone who might still be inside, no protocol for ensuring the building was truly empty of human occupants before the wrecking balls began their work. "We have to report this," I said, my voice rough from disuse. "Someone's living there. They need help." Jamie looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. "Report it to who? The police? Officer, there's a homeless person staying in an abandoned hospital who might also be experiencing a psychological crisis? They'll do a wellness check, maybe, if we're lucky. More likely, they'll just secure the building better and move them along. And where does that person go then? To another abandoned building? To a shelter system just as broken as the hospital system?" I wanted to argue, to insist that we had to do something, but the words died in my throat, because Janie was right. We'd witnessed the failure not just of one institution, but the entire network of care that society pretends to provide. That nurse, whoever they were, had fallen through every safety net, slipped through every crack, until they'd ended up back in the place where they'd once provided care, now unable to access it themselves. The true horror of St. Catherine's wasn't supernatural. It was the realization that the ghost haunting those halls was the ghost of our own abandonment, the specter of systems we'd built and then dismantled, promises we'd made and then broken. The protocols existed, perfect in theory, comprehensive on paper, but protocols require resources, require people, require institutions with the power and will to enforce them. Strip those away, and you're left with nothing but echoes, the ghost of bureaucracy that can haunt but cannot help. I thought about the messages we'd found. Day 47, still no response to emergency calls. How long had that nurse stayed in that building, pressing call buttons for force of habit, waiting for a response that would never come? How many nights had they spent in patient rooms, surrounded by the equipment they'd once used to save lives, now rusted and useless? What does it do to a person's psyche to exist in a space built for care that now offers none? "What if it happens again?" I asked, the question surprising me as much as Jamie. "What if we're in a real emergency someday, and we press the button or pull the alarm or call for help, and nothing? What if the system we think exists is just a ghost, going through the motions but unable to actually respond?" Jamie set down their coffee cup with deliberate care. "It already happens, every day, to people without insurance who can't afford emergency rooms, to homeless people who call 911 and get arrested instead of helped, to people in mental health crises who need care but get cops. The protocols exist, but they don't activate for everyone. St. Catherine's isn't an anomaly. It's just honest about what it is. It's all the gaps in the system made visible, all the people who fall through the cracks concentrated in one place." The diner felt less safe suddenly. The emergency infrastructure I'd been mentally cataloging moments ago revealed as contingent, conditional. The system would respond to some emergencies for some people under some circumstances, but it was never guaranteed. Safety was not a right, but a privilege, distributed unevenly, available primarily to those who could afford it or who fit the right demographic profiles. My phone buzzed again. I'd set up a news alert for St. Catherine's after reading that first article. This alert was different, though. A local news site, a headline that made my blood run cold. Former St. Catherine's nurse found deceased in abandoned hospital. Death ruled exposure and malnutrition. I read the article with shaking hands. The body had been discovered that evening by security guards doing a final sweep before demolition prep. Female, approximately 45-55 years old, identified by hospital credentials found among her belongings as Jennifer Hayes, former charge nurse in the emergency department. She'd been let go during the hospital closure, had struggled to find work in a market flooded with medical professionals from other hospital consolidations. Family had lost contact with her 6 months ago. The article noted that she'd been living in the hospital for an unknown duration. Police had recovered extensive documentation she'd created, patient care logs, incident reports, protocol checklists, all self-referential, all describing a hospital that no longer existed outside her mind. The medical examiner's report suggested severe psychological distress compounded by malnutrition and exposure to cold. She died, the article concluded, despite being surrounded by the infrastructure that should have saved her life. Despite. The word hung in the air like an accusation, not because of the infrastructure's absence, but despite its presence. All those patient rooms, all that medical equipment, however old or degraded, all that knowledge of emergency protocols, none of it had mattered because the system connecting those resources to human need had been severed to save money or simplify administration or appease political pressures. She died pressing call buttons that no longer connected to anyone. "The scream we heard," Jamie said quietly, reading over my shoulder. "That was her. That was her dying." We sat in silence, that terrible knowledge settling over us like snow. We'd been in the building while Jennifer Hayes spent her final hours. We'd explored the evidence of her deterioration, read her desperate messages, witnessed the unraveling of her reality, and we'd run. We'd left her there, alone in that monument to institutional failure, and now she was dead. I wanted to feel guilt, but something more complex settled in its place. Because what could we have done? If we'd found her alive, then what? Call 911? Bring her to another hospital that might treat her immediately but then discharge her back to the streets within hours? Take her to a homeless shelter operating at 200% capacity? Deliver her to a mental health system so overburdened that the average wait for treatment is 3 months? We would have activated protocols, yes, but those protocols might have failed her just as thoroughly as the protocols at St. Catherine's had. The diner's fluorescent lights flickered just for a moment, but it was enough to make my chest tighten. Because this was the real horror, the one that would follow me home and live in the space behind my thoughts. The knowledge that the infrastructure of care is fragile, that it can fail, that it's failing right now for countless people whose names we'll never know. Jennifer Hayes was just the one we happened to encounter, the one whose ghost we happened to witness. How many other Jennifer Hayes existed in cities across the country? How many people were pressing call buttons that no longer connected to anyone? How many were screaming in abandoned spaces, waiting for help that had been decommissioned, defunded, demolished? How many were dying despite being surrounded by the tools that should save them, because the system connecting tools to need had been severed to save money or simplify administration or appease political pressure? I thought about Jennifer's message. I am the emergency, and there is no protocol for this. She was right. There was no code blue for systemic failure, no emergency response plan for the collapse of care infrastructure itself, no protocol that acknowledged the simple, terrible truth. When institutions abandon their purpose, The people who relied on them don't simply disappear. They fall into the gaps. They slip through the cracks. And sometimes they die in abandoned hospitals, pressing call buttons with their last strength, waiting for help that will never arrive. "We should go to the police," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "Tell them what we found, the messages, the documentation, everything." Jamie shook their head slowly. They already found her. They're already doing whatever investigation they do, and then it'll be filed away, a tragic case of a mentally ill homeless person who died from exposure. The system will note her death, process the paperwork, and continue exactly as before, because acknowledging the real cause, the systemic abandonment that killed her, would require examining everything, would require admitting that the infrastructure of care is failing, and that's too big a truth for anyone to face. The check arrived, presented by our waitress with a smile that suggested she'd overheard none of our conversation. I paid in cash, over-tipping compulsively, as if extra money could somehow balance the cosmic scales of care we'd witnessed tilting so catastrophically. We walked to the car in silence, the February night cold enough that I could see my breath, just like in the hospital, just like standing next to Jennifer Hayes' desperate messages. I didn't want to go home. Home felt too normal, too safe, too insulated from the truth we'd discovered. But we drove there anyway, because what else could we do? Jamie pulled up to my apartment, engine idling, neither of us moving to open the doors. "I'll erase the footage, all of it. This isn't content. This isn't a story for our followers." I nodded, relieved. Some explorations revealed only things that should remain buried, not forgotten. Forgetting Jennifer Hayes felt like another abandonment, but not transformed into entertainment either. "But we remember," I said, needing to say it out loud, needing to make it real. "We remember that she was there, that she kept trying, that she maintained protocols even when they'd stopped functioning. We remember that the system failed her." "We remember," Jamie agreed. "And maybe we tell people about it. Not the footage, but the story. Not for views or likes, but because people need to know. They need to know that the infrastructure of care isn't guaranteed, that it requires constant maintenance, constant funding, constant collective will to sustain. They need to know what happens when we let it collapse." I got out of the car, standing on the sidewalk in front of my building. The emergency lighting illuminated the parking lot with that harsh sodium glow that turns everything orange. Above the entrance, I could see the smoke detectors, the sprinkler system, all the passive safety measures we never think about until they're needed. Would they work? If fire broke out, would water actually flow? If I pressed my apartment building's emergency call button, would someone respond? The questions felt like vertigo, like standing on the edge of understanding that everything I'd assumed about safety and care was conditional, contingent, subject to failure. Jennifer Hayes had known this. She'd spent her final weeks documenting the gap between protocol and reality, between theory and practice, between the promise of care and its abandonment. I climbed the stairs to my apartment, each step feeling heavier than it should. Inside, I locked the door and stood in my living room looking at the ordinary objects of daily life. My couch, my television, my bookshelf, everything exactly as I'd left it before the exploration. But I'd changed. I'd seen the ghost of protocol, had witnessed what happens when the infrastructure of care collapses and people are left pressing call buttons that connect to nothing. Later, lying in bed, unable to sleep, I thought about what we'd witnessed. Not just Jennifer Hayes's death, but the mechanism of her abandonment. Every decision that had led to that moment had probably seemed reasonable to whoever made it. Close the hospital to save money. Reasonable. Lay off staff to reduce costs. Reasonable. Decommission emergency systems to avoid liability. Reasonable. Secure the building to prevent trespassers. Reasonable. Each individual decision made sense within its narrow context, but their cumulative effect was to create a death trap, a space where someone could die despite being surrounded by the tools of rescue. This was the real horror, not ghosts or monsters or supernatural evil, but the banal machinery of systemic failure, the way reasonable decisions could accumulate into unreasonable outcomes, the way cost-benefit analyses could erase the messy reality of human need, the way protocols could be perfectly designed and yet perfectly useless because the infrastructure to implement them had been dismantled to save money or simplify administration. I thought about Jennifer Hayes pressing call buttons in the dark, maintaining emergency protocols because it was the only thing she knew how to do, the only way to impose order on chaos. I thought about her writing those patient care logs, creating documentation that no one would ever read, following procedures that no longer connected to any functional system. And I thought about her final realization, written in shaking handwriting. I am the emergency, and there is no protocol for this. She was right. There was no protocol, because the protocols assumed functioning institutions, adequate resources, a collective will to provide care. Strip those away, and all you had left were ghosts. The ghost of safety, the ghost of care, the ghost of the social contract that says we look after each other in moments of crisis. The demolition of St. Catherine's was scheduled for 3 weeks from now. 3 weeks, and then the building would be reduced to rubble, the evidence of its failure erased, the land cleared for redevelopment. Jennifer Hayes's body would be buried, her death filed away as a tragic but isolated incident. The system would note her passing and continue unchanged, because acknowledging the real cause would require looking at the gaps in care infrastructure, the people falling through cracks, the gradual abandonment of collective responsibility for individual well-being. And somewhere else, in some other city, another hospital was being closed due to budget cuts. Another emergency room was being consolidated to improve efficiency. Another nurse was being laid off because the economics didn't work. Another person would find themselves in crisis with no one to respond, pressing call buttons that connected to nothing, screaming in spaces where the protocols had been decommissioned. The ghost of protocol would haunt them too, because that's what ghosts do. They return to spaces where violent endings occurred, where promises were broken, where care was withdrawn, and they wait endlessly for a response that will never come, for systems that have stopped functioning, for the infrastructure of safety that exists in theory but fails in practice. I never went back to St. Catherine's. The demolition proceeded on schedule, and I watched from a distance as the wrecking balls reduced 3 stories of broken promises to rubble. The land sold quickly, redeveloped into luxury apartments. The new building has excellent emergency systems, state-of-the-art fire suppression, rapid response protocols, for the people who can afford to live there. But sometimes, late at night, I think about Jennifer Hayes. I think about her pressing call buttons in the dark, maintaining protocols in a space where protocols had ceased to function. And I wonder if her ghost still haunts that ground, if demolishing the building erased her presence or just dispersed it, scattered her screams across a city full of people pressing their own call buttons, hoping someone will answer, praying the protocols will activate, trusting that the infrastructure of care will hold. It doesn't always hold. That's what I learned in St. Catherine's Medical Center. Sometimes it fails. Sometimes people fall through the cracks. Sometimes you can follow every protocol perfectly and still end up alone in the dark, pressing buttons that connect to nothing, screaming in spaces where no one responds. The real horror isn't that the building was haunted. The real horror is that it didn't need to be. The abandonment was real. The failure was real. The death was real. No supernatural explanation required. Just the banal, everyday evil of systems that stop caring, institutions that prioritize profit over people, and the gradual erosion of the collective will to ensure that when someone screams, someone will answer. I broke protocol during my exploration of St. Catherine's on February 5, 2026. I left when I should have stayed. I ran when I should have helped. I survived when Jennifer Hayes didn't. And now I carry her story, her ghost, her final message. The protocols are ghosts. They haunt but cannot help. Unless we choose to make them real again. Unless we rebuild the infrastructure of care. Unless we decide that safety isn't a privilege but a right. That help should come when people scream, that the social contract matters more than the bottom line. Until then, the ghosts of protocol will continue their vigil in abandoned spaces, pressing call buttons that connect to nothing, waiting for response that never comes, haunting the gaps between theory and practice, between promise and abandonment, between the care we claim to provide and the care we actually deliver. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. Not Jennifer's scream echoing through St. Catherine's halls, but something worse, the silence that followed, the absolute void where response should have been, the ghost of protocol, haunting but helpless, crying out in abandoned spaces where no one will ever answer.